In the summer of 1943, as war continued to consume the world, a group of captured German admirals stepped through the gates of a POW camp in Texas with mortal fears weighing on their minds. Starvation, torture, and revenge. They dared to ask only one humble thing: can we have bread? But the American soldier standing before them smiled and responded with something they never expected. Minutes later, trays of hot hamburgers, grilled corn, and fragrant steaks were brought out. That was the moment when the German officers understood. Even in the midst of war, humanity could be stronger than hatred. The Atlantic waters had turned crimson under the summer Sunday. Admiral Heinrich Baumer stood on the deck of the American destroyer, his gray uniform still damp with seawater and oil. Behind him, 17 officers and sailors from the sunken U-boat fleet stood in silent formation, their faces blank masks hiding terror. They had lost, not just the battle in the North Atlantic, but something deeper: their dignity, their certainty. The iron conviction that the Reich would prevail had cracked like the hull of their submarine. Under depth charges, now they were prisoners, sailing toward an unknown fate in a land they had been taught to despise. Captain Werner Hoffmann stood beside Baumer, his jaw tight. "What do you think they'll do to us?" Baumer didn't answer immediately. He watched the American sailors moving across the deck with casual efficiency, their movements relaxed, almost careless. It unsettled him. Where was the rigid discipline? Where was the martial bearing? "I don't know," Baumer finally said. His voice was barely audible over the engine noise. "But I've heard stories about what happens to prisoners." The stories had circulated through the German naval command for years. Whispers of Allied brutality, of prisoners worked to death in mines, of summary executions. Propaganda, perhaps, but when you're standing on an enemy ship with nothing but the clothes on your back, even propaganda feels like prophecy. Lieutenant Ernst Müller, the youngest of the captured officers at 26, shifted his weight nervously. His hands trembled slightly, though whether from cold or fear, no one asked. "My father was in the Great War," he said quietly. He said, "The Americans weren't cruel. Not like—" "Don't," Hoffmann cut him off. "That was a different war. Different times." But Baumer had heard the same stories. His own uncle had been captured by American forces in 1918 and returned home healthy, even well-fed. That uncle had spoken of American generosity with a confusion that bordered on suspicion. "They gave us cigarettes," he'd said. "Real cigarettes. They shared their rations." Could that happen again? In this war, where hatred ran so much deeper, the destroyer cut through the waves for 3 more days before making port in Virginia. From there, the prisoners were loaded onto a train, a hot, rattling cattle car that smelled of dust and diesel. Through the slats, they watched America pass by endless fields, small towns with white churches, children waving at the train without knowing who rode inside. "It's untouched," Hoffmann observed with bitter amazement. "No bombs, no ruins. They don't know what war is." Baumer said nothing. The observation was accurate but painful. Germany lay in rubble. These people lived as if the world wasn't burning. The train journey took 2 days. The heat became oppressive as they traveled south, and the prisoners were given water but little else. By the time they reached Texas, hunger had become a constant companion, gnawing and insistent. Camp Hearn sat in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by flat scrubland and mesquite trees. As the truck convoy approached, Baumer studied the facility through tired eyes. Watchtowers, barbed wire, barracks arranged in neat rows. A prison. "Don't," Hoffmann cut him off. That was a different war. Different times. The truck stopped at the main gate. An American sergeant, clipboard in hand, walked down the line of prisoners as they climbed out. His face was weathered and expressionless, neither cruel nor kind. A prison. They obeyed, muscle memory overriding exhaustion. "Stand straight. Eyes forward. Maintain discipline, even when everything else has been stripped away." The sergeant walked the line slowly, checking faces against his list. When he reached Baumer, he paused. Admiral? Yes. Name? Heinrich Baumer. The sergeant made a mark on his clipboard. No mockery, no triumph, just bureaucratic efficiency. When the inspection finished, the sergeant stepped back. For a long moment, he simply looked at them, 17 men in soiled uniforms, trying desperately to maintain the bearing of naval officers, while terror ate at them from within. Then Lieutenant Mueller spoke. His voice cracked slightly. Sir, may we have some bread? Just a little? The words hung in the hot Texas air. A simple request. A humble plea. They weren't asking for mercy or special treatment. Just bread. The most basic sustenance. The American sergeant's expression changed. Something shifted behind his eyes, not pity exactly, but recognition. He turned away, and Baumer's heart sank. The request had been too bold. They would be punished for asking. But then the sergeant called out to someone Baumer couldn't see. Get the kitchen crew. Bring proper food for these men. Proper food? Baumer exchanged glances with Hoffman. Neither dared to hope. The August sun beat down on the parade ground as the German prisoners stood in formation, waiting. Around them, the camp bustled with activity that seemed almost surreal in its ordinariness. American soldiers moved between buildings, some laughing, others smoking cigarettes in the shade. From somewhere nearby came the sound of a radio playing jazz music. It was nothing like Baumer had imagined. He had expected brutality, or at least cold indifference. Instead, the camp felt almost relaxed. The American guards carried rifles, but they weren't pointing them. They leaned against buildings, chatted with each other, exhibited none of the rigid tension that characterized German military installations. This doesn't make sense, Hoffman muttered beside him. Before Baumer could respond, a group of American soldiers emerged from a building marked Mess Hall. They carried large trays covered with white cloths. The smell that preceded them made Baumer's stomach clench with sudden, desperate hunger. The sergeant who had taken their names supervised as the trays were set on tables hastily arranged in the shade. When he pulled back the first cloth, Baumer heard Lieutenant Mueller gasp. Hamburgers. At least 20 of them, thick patties on soft buns, still steaming. Grilled corn on the cob, golden and buttered. Mashed potatoes, and on the final tray, what looked like actual steak seared beef that sent an aroma of char and fat into the air. For a moment, no one moved. The German officers stared at the food as if it might be a hallucination brought on by hunger and stress. Well, the sergeant said, gesturing toward the tables. Eat. You've had a long journey. Still they hesitated. This had to be a trick. A test. Perhaps the food was poisoned. Or perhaps they would be punished for accepting it. Accused of greed or presumption. But Baumer was an admiral, and 17 men were looking to him for direction. He stepped forward, picked up one of the hamburgers, and bit into it. The taste exploded across his tongue. Meat. Real meat. Seasoned and perfectly cooked. The bun was soft, fresh. He had to fight the urge to devour it like a starving animal. Behind him, the dam broke. His men surged forward, not in a disorderly rush, but with the swift, purposeful movement of truly hungry men trying to maintain dignity. They filled plates, found seats on benches, and ate with a focus that bordered on reverence. Baumer watched them while eating his own meal slowly, trying to process what was happening. This food was better than what they had served their own enlisted men. Better than anything he'd eaten in the last year of the war, when German rations had grown sparse and tasteless. Captain Hoffman sat down beside him with a plate piled high. For a long moment, he just stared at his food. Then, very quietly, he said, "Admiral, why are they doing this?" The taste exploded across his tongue. Meat. Real meat. Seasoned and perfectly cooked. The bun was soft, fresh. He had to fight the urge to devour it like a starving animal. Baumer watched them while eating his own meal slowly, trying to process what was happening. This food was better than what they had served their own enlisted men. Better than anything he'd eaten in the last year of the war, when German rations had grown sparse and tasteless. Baumer had no answer. He took another bite of his hamburger, but the taste had become complicated, mixed with shame and confusion. Lieutenant Mueller appeared to be close to tears. The young officer sat alone at the end of a bench, holding a piece of steak he hadn't yet eaten. "My last letter from home," he said to no one in particular. "My mother wrote that they haven't had real meat in 8 months. Just ersatz. Substitutes. And we're eating steak." One of the American soldiers, a young private with red hair and freckles, approached their table with a pitcher of cold water. He refilled their cups without being asked, then lingered awkwardly. "Sir," he said, addressing Baumer, "are you really an admiral? Like, a real one?" The question was so innocent, so devoid of hostility, that Baumer found himself answering honestly, "Yes. I commanded the 7th Submarine Fleet." The private's eyes widened. "Wow. I've never met an admiral before." He paused, then added with genuine curiosity, "What's it like? Commanding submarines, I mean." Hoffman looked ready to snap at the boy, but Baumer raised a hand. "Terrifying," he said simply. "Every time you dive, you wonder if you'll surface again." The private nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah, I guess that makes sense." He glanced back at his fellow guards, then leaned in slightly. "For what it's worth, sir, most of us are just glad the fighting's over, at least for you guys." He walked away before Baumer could formulate a response. "They're treating us like people," Hoffman said slowly, as if testing the words. "Not like enemies, not like prisoners. Like people." The private nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah, I guess that makes sense." He glanced back at his fellow guards, then leaned in slightly. "For what it's worth, sir, most of us are just glad the fighting's over, at least for you guys." "Sir," he said, addressing Baumer, "are you really an admiral? Like, a real one?" The private nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah, I guess that makes sense." He glanced back at his fellow guards, then leaned in slightly. "For what it's worth, sir, most of us are just glad the fighting's over, at least for you guys." "It's more than satisfactory," Baumer replied carefully. "It's generous. Unexpectedly so." The captain smiled slightly. "We follow the Geneva Convention here, sir. Prisoners of war are to be treated humanely. That includes proper nutrition." He paused, then added, "Besides, you asked for bread. We're Americans. We don't do things by half measures." He walked away, leaving Baumer staring after him. "This is wrong," Lieutenant Mueller said suddenly. Several heads turned toward him. "Not wrong that they're feeding us. Wrong that we never did this. For prisoners we took, we gave them scraps, treated them like." His voice broke. "God forgive us." Silence fell over the German officers. Because Mueller had spoken the thought many of them were having, the uncomfortable truth that this simple act of decency had revealed. They were being shown what they should have been all along. The next morning began with confusion. At dawn, American guards knocked on the barracks doors and announced breakfast in 30 minutes. The German prisoners assembled, expecting the same cold efficiency of military routine they knew from home. Instead, they found a mess hall filled with the smells of coffee, eggs, and bacon. "Sir, not prisoner, not enemy. Sir, not prisoner, not enemy. Sir." Instead, they found a mess hall filled with the smells of coffee, eggs, and bacon. "I don't understand their strategy." "Strategy?" Baumer asked. Baumer stood in the serving line, tray in hand, feeling profoundly disoriented. The American cook, a large black man with kind eyes, served him scrambled eggs with a nod and, "Good morning, sir." "Perhaps," Baumer said slowly, "they simply believe it's the right thing to do." Hoffman looked at him as if he'd spoken in a foreign language, but over the following days, that incomprehensible possibility began to seem like the only explanation. The Americans continued to treat them with consistent, almost boring decency. They were given clean bedding, adequate washing facilities, access to medical care for the minor injuries some had sustained during capture. On the third day, they were assembled in the yard. Baumer braced himself for the real prisoner experience to begin the work details. The punishment. the breaking of their spirits. Instead, an American lieutenant explained the camp rules in careful German. They would have daily work assignments, but nothing hazardous. They could send and receive mail through the International Red Cross. They had access to a small library. They could organize sports and recreation during free time. "You are prisoners of war," the lieutenant said, "but you are still men entitled to dignity and basic rights. We expect you to follow the rules. In return, we will treat you in accordance with international law." After he dismissed them, the German officers stood in uncertain clusters. This wasn't imprisonment as they understood it. It was something else entirely. "It's humiliating," Captain Reinhardt, one of the U-boat commanders, said bitterly. "They're being kind to us. Don't they understand? Kindness from your enemy is worse than cruelty. Cruelty you can hate. Kindness makes you question everything." Baumer understood exactly what he meant. Every decent act from their captors was a mirror held up to their own conduct. Had they treated prisoners this way? Had they even thought to? That afternoon, during the work assignment helping to expand the vegetable garden, Baumer found himself working alongside a young American guard named Thomas. The boy couldn't have been more than 19. With an open, friendly face. "You plant gardens differently in Germany?" Thomas asked, watching Baumer methodically prepare the soil. "Not so differently. Good soil is good soil anywhere." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "My dad has a farm in Iowa. I grew up doing this." He paused, then added, with the brutal honesty of youth, "I'm glad I'm here instead of fighting." "Is that wrong?" "No," Baumer said quietly. "It's human." They worked in silence for a while. Then Thomas said, "My brother's ship was sunk. In the Atlantic. They never found him." Baumer's hands stilled. He looked at the young American, waiting for the accusation, the rage, the perfectly justified hatred. "No," Baumer said quietly. "It's human. I don't understand their strategy." Thomas looked up, surprised. "Yeah, me too." He wiped sweat from his forehead. "Do you have family?" "A wife, 2 daughters, in Hamburg. Are they safe?" "I don't know." Baumer's voice came out rougher than intended. "We don't get news. I don't know if my home still stands." Thomas absorbed this. "I'll pray for them," he said simply. "Your family, I mean." It was such an absurd thing, an American soldier offering to pray for a German admiral's family, that Baumer almost laughed. But the offer had been genuine, and laughter would have been cruel. "Thank you," he said instead. "Are they safe?" In the bunk beside him, Lieutenant Mueller was writing a letter home. Permitted under the Red Cross protocols. The young officer's pen scratched across the paper in the dim light. "What are you telling them?" Baumer asked. Mueller didn't look up. "The truth. That we're being treated well. That the Americans feed us properly and allow us dignity." He paused. "My mother won't believe it, but I'm telling her anyway." Why wouldn't she believe it? In the bunk beside him, Lieutenant Mueller was writing a letter home. Permitted under the Red Cross protocols. The young officer's pen scratched across the paper in the dim light. Across the room, Hoffman sat on his bunk, head in his hands. "I keep thinking about the British pilots we captured," he said quietly. "We put them in concrete cells, fed them thin soup and black bread. I told myself it was necessary, that resources were scarce. But that was a lie too, wasn't it? We could have done better. We chose not to." No one answered him. What was there to say? The shame was a living thing in the barracks that night, heavy and suffocating. They had been shown what decency looked like, and in that showing, they saw the reflection of what they had been. But Baumer also felt something else stirring, something unexpected. Hope. Mueller didn't look up. The truth. That we're being treated well. That the Americans feed us properly and allow us dignity. He paused. "My mother won't believe it, but I'm telling her anyway." But Baumer also felt something else stirring, something unexpected. The weeks blended into months, and Camp Hearn revealed itself to be unlike anything the German prisoners had imagined. The daily routine established a rhythm that was almost peaceful. Breakfast at 7, work details from 8 to noon, lunch, then free time until dinner, followed by evening activities. The work wasn't difficult. Some men tended the gardens that now supplied fresh vegetables to the camp kitchen. Others helped with maintenance, carpentry, or cleaning. Baumer found himself assigned to the administrative office, helping translate documents and organize records. The Americans seemed to recognize that using an admiral for manual labor was both inefficient and unnecessarily degrading. But it was the free time that transformed the camp from a prison into something stranger and more complicated. They watched in silence for a moment. Then Patterson said, "You seem troubled, Admiral." Lieutenant Mueller scored a goal and his teammates mobbed him with genuine joy. For those few moments, they weren't prisoners. They were just men playing a game in the sunshine. "Your lieutenant is quite good," said a voice beside Baumer. He turned to find the camp commander, Colonel Patterson, a tall man in his 50s with graying hair and sharp blue eyes. "He played for his university team," Baumer replied. They watched in silence for a moment. Then Patterson said, "You seem troubled, Admiral." Baumer considered denying it. But what was the point? "I feel I'm in a strange dream. A comfortable dream, but still a dream. And I worry what will happen when I wake." Baumer considered denying it. But what was the point? "I feel I'm in a strange dream. A comfortable dream, but still a dream. And I worry what will happen when I wake." But why? The question burst out before Baumer could stop it. "We are your enemies. We killed your men. Why treat us better than we deserve?" On a Sunday afternoon in September, Baumer stood at the edge of what had become the camp's soccer field. A match was underway, German prisoners versus German prisoners, shirts versus skins, with American guards sitting in the grass watching and occasionally cheering for impressive plays. "That's a dangerous philosophy," Baumer said quietly. "It removes personal responsibility." Does it? Or does it recognize that most people, given the same circumstances, would do the same things? Patterson gestured toward the soccer game. "Those men aren't evil. They're sailors who served their country. Now the war has passed them by, and they're here. We can make their time here miserable, or we can treat them like human beings. We chose the latter." Across the room, Hoffman sat on his bunk, head in his hands. "I keep thinking about the British pilots we captured," he said quietly. "We put them in concrete cells, fed them thin soup and black bread. I told myself it was necessary, that resources were scarce. But that was a lie too, wasn't it? We could have done better. We chose not to. The world runs on both, Admiral. Ideals give us direction. Practicality gets us there." Baumer smiled slightly. "That's more cynical. I almost prefer it to pure idealism. You couldn't have known." Patterson walked away, leaving Baumer to watch the game. But his mind was elsewhere, thinking about what the colonel had said, about how treating enemies said more about the captor than the captive. That evening, during mail call, Lieutenant Mueller received a letter from home. The young officer's face went pale as he read it, and he excused himself to sit alone on his bunk. Patterson walked away, leaving Baumer to watch the game. But his mind was elsewhere, thinking about what the colonel had said, about how treating enemies said more about the captor than the captive. Across the room, Hoffman sat on his bunk, head in his hands. "I keep thinking about the British pilots we captured," he said quietly. "We put them in concrete cells, fed them thin soup and black bread. I told myself it was necessary, that resources were scarce. But that was a lie too, wasn't it? We could have done better. We chose not to." Baumer sat down heavily beside him. Hamburg. His own family was in Hamburg. Patterson walked away, leaving Baumer to watch the game. But his mind was elsewhere, thinking about what the colonel had said, about how treating enemies said more about the captor than the captive. "I'm sorry," he said, though the words were worthless. "You couldn't have known. The letter I sent home, telling them I was being treated well, she never got to read it." Mueller's voice was hollow. "She died thinking I was suffering, and I was eating steak." There was no comfort to offer, no words that could make sense of such absurd injustice. So Baumer simply sat with him, sharing the weight of grief. Later that week, the camp received a shipment of books for the prisoner library. Among them were German classics, Goethe, Schiller, Mann. Captain Hoffman spent an entire evening organizing them, creating a cataloging system with the precision of a military operation. You couldn't have known. That evening, during mail call, Lieutenant Mueller received a letter from home. The young officer's face went pale as he read it, and he excused himself to sit alone on his bunk. But it was the American books that surprised him most. They had included English-language novels in the library, too. Hemingway, Steinbeck, Fitzgerald, and in a gesture that seemed almost defiant in its optimism, English primers and dictionaries. They want us to learn English, Hoffman observed. Why? Perhaps, Baumer said. They think the war will end someday. And when it does, we'll need to communicate with the world again. The idea seemed almost fantastical. An end to the war. A return to normal life. Could such a thing even exist anymore? The library became a sanctuary. Men who hadn't read for pleasure in years rediscovered the escape of literature. Baumer found himself rereading Faust, finding new meaning in the familiar words. The story of a man who made a bargain with darkness felt uncomfortably relevant. In any case, Patterson continued, practical considerations matter too. Well-treated prisoners don't cause problems. They don't try to escape. They don't riot or sabotage. Kindness is also good strategy. The world runs on both, Admiral. Ideals give us direction. Practicality gets us there. Stunned silence filled the hall. We're being paid? Captain Reinhardt asked incredulously. To work? Yes. Geneva Convention requires it. Prisoners of war who work must be compensated. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. My dad has a farm in Iowa. I grew up doing this. He paused, then added, with the brutal honesty of youth, I'm glad I'm here instead of fighting. Is that wrong? There was no comfort to offer, no words that could make sense of such absurd injustice. So Baumer simply sat with him, sharing the weight of grief. Lieutenant Mueller stood in front of the display like a child at Christmas. Real chocolate, he whispered. Hershey's chocolate. I haven't seen chocolate in 2 years. He bought 4 bars and sent them home with his next letter, along with half his wages converted to international money order through the Red Cross system, for his mother and surviving younger brother. But it was the American books that surprised him most. They had included English-language novels in the library, too. Hemingway, Steinbeck, Fitzgerald, and in a gesture that seemed almost defiant in its optimism, English primers and dictionaries. Hoffman bought a deck of cards and organized a weekly poker game. We're prisoners of war playing poker for money we earned from our captors, he said with bewildered laughter. Nothing about this makes sense, but the most profound change wasn't the purchases, it was what the wages represented. Agency, choice, the ability to make decisions, however small, about their own lives. On the first Monday of October, something happened that shattered what remained of the prisoners' understanding of their situation. The camp began to feel less like a prison and more like a strange hybrid, part military installation, part small town. Men established routines, friendships, even hobbies. One prisoner, a former chef, convinced the American cooks to let him prepare traditional German meals for holidays. Another organized a choir that practiced twice weekly. We're becoming comfortable, Hoffman observed one evening. Is that wrong? Should we be more resistant, more defiant? Thomas nodded thoughtfully. My dad has a farm in Iowa. I grew up doing this. He paused, then added, with the brutal honesty of youth, I'm glad I'm here instead of fighting. Is that wrong? It would maintain our dignity as German officers. I think, Baumer said slowly, that accepting kindness with grace requires more dignity than rejecting it with pride. The camp began to feel less like a prison and more like a strange hybrid, part military installation, part small town. Men established routines, friendships, even hobbies. One prisoner, a former chef, convinced the American cooks to let him prepare traditional German meals for holidays. Another organized a choir that practiced twice weekly. "They're trying to break us," Kessler insisted. "Make us forget who we are. Make us forget the fatherland." Most men ignored him. But his words planted seeds of guilt in some minds. Were they betraying their country by accepting this treatment? By enjoying small comforts while Germany burned? Baumer struggled with these questions himself. Every night, he thought of his wife and daughters in Hamburg. Were they safe? Were they hungry? Did they have heat for the winter? And here he was, warm and fed, earning wages for light work. The guilt was crushing sometimes. But then he would remember what Colonel Patterson had said. Their government was the enemy, not them. They hadn't chosen this war. They had simply been caught in it, like millions of others. Baumer saved most of his wages at first, unsure what to do with them. Then one day he saw a fountain pen in the canteen. Beautiful and simple. He bought it and began writing a journal, documenting everything that was happening. Someday, he thought, someone should know about this. About how kindness could exist even in the heart of war. The story of how enemies treated each other with humanity. How a simple question, "Can we have bread?" had been answered with hamburgers and steaks, and something far more precious. The recognition that even in war, people were still people. December brought cold to Texas. Nothing like the brutal winters of northern Germany, but enough to require jackets and make the prisoners grateful for the heated barracks. On a gray Tuesday afternoon, a work detail was helping to repair a section of fence damaged by a recent storm. Baumer was part of the group, along with Hoffman, Mueller, and several others. 2 American guards supervised Thomas, the young private who had become something of a friend, and an older sergeant named Williams. The work was proceeding normally when Williams, standing on a ladder to secure the top wire, lost his balance. The ladder toppled sideways, and Williams fell backward toward a pile of broken fence posts, their ends jagged and sharp. The work was proceeding normally when Williams, standing on a ladder to secure the top wire, lost his balance. The ladder toppled sideways, and Williams fell backward toward a pile of broken fence posts, their ends jagged and sharp. Baumer saved most of his wages at first, unsure what to do with them. Then one day he saw a fountain pen in the canteen. Beautiful and simple. He bought it and began writing a journal, documenting everything that was happening. Someday, he thought, someone should know about this. About how kindness could exist even in the heart of war. How a simple question, "Can we have bread?" had been answered with hamburgers and steaks, and something far more precious. The recognition that even in war, people were still people. William stared at the young German officer. You saved my life." Mueller looked embarrassed. It was instinct. Anyone would have done it. Most men ignored him. But his words planted seeds of guilt in some minds. Were they betraying their country by accepting this treatment? By enjoying small comforts while Germany burned? On a gray Tuesday afternoon, a work detail was helping to repair a section of fence damaged by a recent storm. Baumer was part of the group, along with Hoffman, Mueller, and several others. 2 American guards supervised Thomas, the young private who had become something of a friend, and an older sergeant named Williams. Mueller looked embarrassed. It was instinct. Anyone would have done it. The next morning, Colonel Patterson called a special assembly. Both guards and prisoners attended, forming up in the cold December air. Patterson stood before them, Williams beside him. "Yesterday," the colonel said, "something happened that I want everyone to understand." Sergeant Williams fell. He could have been seriously injured or killed. And Lieutenant Mueller, a prisoner of war, a man who has every reason to feel no loyalty to us, risked himself to save him. He paused, letting the words sink in. He paused, letting the words sink in. Williams stepped forward. He looked uncomfortable being the center of attention, but determined to speak. "I want to thank Lieutenant Mueller publicly, and I want to say something else. I've been a soldier for 20 years. I've seen a lot of combat, a lot of enemies, and I've learned that there's soldiers and there's evil men, and they're not always the same thing. That evening, word of the incident spread through the camp like wildfire. The Americans talked about it in their mess. The Germans discussed it in their barracks, and something shifted in the air, subtle but profound. They shook, German prisoner and American guard, while the others watched in silence. Admiral Baumer found himself stepping forward without consciously deciding to do so. He came to attention and addressed Colonel Patterson formally. "Sir, may I speak?" "Of course, Admiral." Baumer turned to face both groups' captors and captives, Americans and Germans. Colonel Patterson said that what Lieutenant Mueller did was natural. "I'm not sure I agree. Or rather, I think it should be natural. But we've spent so many years making enemies of each other that we've forgotten how." His voice grew stronger. "Yesterday, my officer didn't act like a prisoner. He didn't act like a German. He acted like a human being seeing another human being in danger. This is what we should all be. This is what we were before the war. Taught us to hate." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "I have been in this camp for 4 months. In that time, you Americans have treated us with a kindness I didn't know still existed in the world. You fed us, housed us, paid us, respected us, and for 4 months, I've struggled to understand why." Colonel Patterson started to speak, but Baumer held up a hand respectfully. "I understand now. It's because you never forgot we were human. You never let the war make you into something you weren't. And in showing us that humanity, you've reminded us of our own." The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. Then William stepped forward and saluted Baumer, a crisp, genuine military salute. After a moment of surprise, Baumer returned it. The gesture broke something open. American guards and German prisoners began talking to each other more freely, not as enemies forced into proximity, but as men who had found common ground in the most unlikely place. That night, the mood in the barracks was different, lighter somehow. "I think I understand now," Hoffman said quietly. "Why they treat us this way. It's not strategy or propaganda. They genuinely believe that this is how people should treat each other, even enemies." "Is it naive?" Mueller asked. His shoulder was bandaged, but he'd refused to make a fuss about the injury. "Maybe," Baumer said. "But if so, it's a beautiful naivety. The kind the world needs more of." Kessler, the hardliner who had always resisted the American kindness, sat alone on his bunk. But Baumer noticed he was writing a letter home, and for the first time since they'd been captured, Kessler's expression wasn't hard with resentment. Perhaps even the most resistant heart could be changed by consistent kindness. Or perhaps, and this seemed more likely, Kessler had been waiting for permission to let go of his anger. And Mueller's act had given him that permission. Spring 1945 brought news that filtered through the camp in whispers and fragments. The war in Europe was collapsing. The Reich was falling. The German prisoners listened to BBC broadcasts, permitted by Colonel Patterson as part of their right to information, and heard about the fall of Berlin, the suicide of Hitler, the unconditional surrender. Germany had lost. They had known it was coming, but the reality was still crushing. Everything they had fought for was gone. The country they remembered no longer existed. In the barracks, men wept openly. Not for the Nazi regime, most had long since stopped believing in that, but for Germany itself. For their families, for the uncertainty of what came next. "What will we go home to?" Mueller asked. The young lieutenant looked older now, worn by the weight of too much knowledge. "My city is rubble. My sister is dead. My father disappeared in the retreat from Russia. It's just my mother and brother left. What kind of country can we build from that?" No one had answers, but the Americans surprised them again. As the reality of Germany's defeat became clear, the tone in the camp didn't change. There was no gloating, no celebration at their enemy's expense. Instead, Colonel Patterson increased the prisoners' access to information about reconstruction efforts and opportunities to contribute to rebuilding plans. "You'll be going home eventually," he told them. "And when you do, Germany will need good men to help rebuild. Not the ideologues and fanatics, but people who remember what decency looks like. Weeks turned into months. The war in the Pacific continued, but the German prisoners' war was over. Now they simply waited for logistics to catch up with reality, for ships to be available, for processing centers to be established, for the long journey home to begin. During this limbo period, something unexpected happened. The Americans organized a series of educational programs, classes in English, American government, agricultural techniques, trade skills. They were optional, but most prisoners attended eagerly. "They're preparing us for peace," Hoffman observed, "teaching us how to live in a world without war." Baumer attended every class he could. He was 53 years old, an admiral who would never command ships again. But he learned about crop rotation and democratic principles and market economics with the eagerness of a student. Because Colonel Patterson was right, Germany would need good men. And perhaps the greatest gift of his captivity was this: he had been given time to remember what kind of man he wanted to be. In June, the first group of prisoners was called for repatriation. The excitement was palpable, but so was the fear. What would they find when they returned? Lieutenant Mueller was in that first group. The night before his departure, he sat with Baumer and Hoffman in the quiet barracks. "I'm terrified," he admitted. "I've been safer here than I ever was in Germany during the war. And now I have to go back to—" He trailed off. "To your mother," Baumer said gently. "To your brother. To the work of rebuilding. What if I can't? What if I'm not strong enough?" "You saved Sergeant Williams," Hoffman reminded him. "You had the strength to see a human being who needed help and to act. That's the same strength you'll need at home." The next morning, they assembled to see the first group off. Colonel Patterson shook each man's hand. Sergeant Williams embraced Mueller with tears in his eyes. "You take care of yourself," Williams said. "And if you ever get the chance, write to me. Let me know you're okay." "I will," Mueller promised. As the trucks rolled away carrying the first group toward the ships that would take them home, Baumer felt an unexpected ache. This place had been a prison, but it had also been a sanctuary, a pocket of humanity in an inhumane world. What would await them outside its gates? August 1945 brought the end of all hostilities. Japan surrendered, and the world's deadliest war was finally over. In Camp Hearn, the remaining German prisoners prepared for their own departures. Baumer was in one of the last groups to leave. By then, the camp had become eerily quiet, with only a few dozen men remaining where once there had been hundreds. On his final night, he walked the grounds one last time, past the soccer field where men had played and laughed, past the gardens they had tended, past the library where he had rediscovered his love of reading. Colonel Patterson found him there, standing alone in the twilight. The next morning, they assembled to see the first group off. Colonel Patterson shook each man's hand. Sergeant Williams embraced Mueller with tears in his eyes. Colonel Patterson found him there, standing alone in the twilight. Strange how? Baumer considered the question. "I came here expecting the worst of humanity. Instead, I found some of the best. It has changed me." "Good," Patterson said simply. "That's what I hoped for. Not to break you, but to remind you of what you could be." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Patterson said, "I have something for you." He handed Baumer an envelope. Inside was a letter of character reference, written on official U.S. Army letterhead, attesting to Baumer's conduct during his imprisonment and recommending him for any future employment or civic responsibility. He handed Baumer an envelope. Inside was a letter of character reference, written on official U.S. Army letterhead, attesting to Baumer's conduct during his imprisonment and recommending him for any future employment or civic responsibility. "Yes, I did. You're going home to a devastated country that will need good leaders. This might help." Baumer looked at the letter, then at the American colonel. "Why? After everything, why do you care what happens to us?" "You didn't have to do this," Baumer said, his voice thick. The next morning, the final group assembled for the last time. The remaining American guards stood in formation, a gesture of respect. Thomas, who had befriended Balmer months ago, had tears running down his face. As they boarded the trucks, Sergeant Williams called out, "Remember what you learned here, but the legacy remains." Balmer thought about the Hamburgers when they'd asked for bread, about the wages and the soccer games, about Mueller saving Williams, and the salutes exchanged between former enemies. As they boarded the trucks, Sergeant Williams called out, "Remember what you learned here." The journey home was long and difficult. The ship was crowded, the conditions basic. But after the comfort of Camp Hearn, no one complained. When they finally reached Germany, the reality of their defeat hit with full force. Cities in ruins, people starving, infrastructure destroyed. The country they had left no longer existed. Balmer made his way to Hamburg and found his home still standing, though damaged. His wife and daughters had survived, living in 2 rooms while the rest of the house was uninhabitable. "That kindness is stronger than we think," he said finally. "That humanity can survive even in the worst circumstances. That how we treat our enemies says everything about who we are." "Were you treated badly?" Balmer thought about how to answer. About the hamburgers and the steaks. About being paid for his work. About Colonel Patterson and Sergeant Williams and young Thomas, who had prayed for his family. "No," he said finally. "I was treated with more kindness than I deserved. And it taught me something important about how I want to live from now on." In the years that followed, Balmer became involved in reconstruction efforts in Hamburg. He used the skills he'd learned in Camp Hearn, the English language, the democratic principles, the agricultural techniques. But more than that, he used the lesson of kindness. When working with former enemies became necessary for rebuilding, Balmer remembered how the Americans had treated him. He advocated for cooperation over resentment, for humanity over ideology. Balmer thought about how to answer. About the hamburgers and the steaks. About being paid for his work. About Colonel Patterson and Sergeant Williams and young Thomas, who had prayed for his family. "No," he said finally. "I was treated with more kindness than I deserved. And it taught me something important about how I want to live from now on. We were shown what we should have been," he would say, "and we must never forget that lesson." In 1963, Balmer was invited to speak at a conference on POW treatment and the Geneva Conventions. He was 71 years old, still sharp, still carrying the fountain pen he'd bought at the Camp Hearn canteen. He told the story of their capture, their fear, and the moment when Lieutenant Mueller had asked, "Can we have bread? Were you treated badly?" He paused, letting the weight of that fear settle over his audience. "I think I understand now," Hoffman said quietly. "Why they treat us this way. It's not strategy or propaganda. They genuinely believe that this is how people should treat each other, even enemies. But it wasn't just the food," Balmer continued. "It was everything that followed. The wages, the respect, the soccer games, and libraries, and education. The consistent, boring, everyday decency that never wavered, even when they learned of atrocities committed by our countrymen. Were you treated badly?" His voice grew stronger. "I have spent the last 18 years helping to rebuild Germany. And every day, I think about Camp Hearn, about Colonel Patterson, who believed that peace mattered more than war, about Sergeant Williams, who thanked the prisoner who saved his life, about young Private Thomas, who prayed for my family while his own brother lay dead in the Atlantic, killed perhaps by the very submarines I commanded. These men did not forget that we were their enemies. But they refused to let that enmity define their treatment of us. They held to a higher principle, that all human beings deserve dignity, even especially those who have opposed you." The room was silent. The hamburgers we received that day were more than food, Balmer concluded. They were a symbol, a statement that said, "You are human. You matter. The war is between governments and ideologies. But you, the individual man before me, you deserve to be treated with basic kindness." In a world that had forgotten mercy, they remembered. And that changed everything. When Baumer died in 1978, his obituary mentioned his naval career and his work in rebuilding Hamburg. But those who attended his funeral remembered him best for his stories about an American POW camp in Texas, where kindness had proven stronger than hatred. Instead, they brought us hamburgers, steaks, corn, real food, cooked with care, and in that moment, with that simple act of generosity, they dismantled everything we thought we knew about our enemies. We expected cruelty, he told the assembled delegates. We had been taught that Americans were barbaric, that surrender meant torture and death. We asked for bread because we thought that was all we might receive. Perhaps not even that. People asked me why I did it. Mueller said, his voice weak but clear. Why save the life of a guard when I was a prisoner? But that's the wrong question. The right question is, why wouldn't I? He was a human being falling toward injury. The response was instinctive. We are all human before we are anything else. We expected cruelty, he told the assembled delegates. We had been taught that Americans were barbaric, that surrender meant torture and death. We asked for bread because we thought that was all we might receive. Perhaps not even that. In a world that had forgotten mercy, they remembered. And that changed everything. The historian asked him about the food, about the famous moment when they asked for bread and received hamburgers. Mueller smiled. We were so hungry, so afraid. We thought we might starve, might be tortured, and they brought us steaks. He shook his head in wonder. Even 50 years later, it was absurd, wonderful, completely unexpected. But you know what I remember most? Not the taste of the food, though it was delicious. I remember the American cook's face. He was smiling, genuinely happy to feed us. We were enemy prisoners, and he was happy to feed us. That smile changed my life. Because it told me that goodness wasn't dead, that somewhere in the world, people still cared about doing the right thing, even when it was hard, even when the recipients didn't deserve it. Those hamburgers tasted like hope. Today, Camp Hearn is mostly gone. The barracks were dismantled decades ago. The land returned to other uses. Only a small memorial stands where the camp once was, marking the place where thousands of German prisoners spent the war in unexpected comfort. The historian asked him about the food, about the famous moment when they asked for bread and received hamburgers. The men who were imprisoned there went home changed. They became teachers, leaders, advocates for human rights and international cooperation. They raised children and grandchildren with the understanding that enemies can become friends, that kindness can transcend conflict. They told their stories about being treated with dignity when they expected degradation, about learning English and democratic principles from their captors, about soccer games and libraries and wages earned for honest work. And they always told about the hamburgers. But the legacy remains. In a world that had forgotten mercy, they remembered. And that changed everything. Because it answers a fundamental question about who we are as human beings. When we have power over our enemies, when we could exact revenge without consequence, when hatred would be justified and cruelty would be understood, what do we choose? The Americans at Camp Hearn chose kindness. But the legacy remains. The Americans at Camp Hearn chose kindness. In a world that had forgotten mercy, they remembered. And that changed everything. But the legacy remains. In a world that had forgotten mercy, they remembered. And that changed everything. But the legacy remains. In a world that had forgotten mercy, they remembered. And that changed everything. And they never forgot it. The Americans at Camp Hearn chose kindness. We can choose revenge or kindness, cruelty or compassion, hatred or humanity. The Americans at Camp Hearn made their choice. And 70 years later, we're still talking about the hamburgers they served to men who asked only for bread. That's the power of kindness. That's the legacy that remains. That's the lesson we must never forget.